Welcome. So, if you have interest in the gold geology of Jamaica, you should also have interest in gold geology in the countries of Nicaragua, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. Now, the reason for this is because there are professionals who work in this space and indicate that Jamaica's gold metallogeny and other precious metals is closely linked or shares a close relationship with Nicaragua, Hispaniola, which houses Haiti, Dominican Republic, as well as Puerto Rico. Now, to fully understand the metallogeny of Jamaica as well as other countries mentioned, we would have to understand the geologic history of the said countries and even further have some insight into the geologic history of the Caribbean plate, pretty much because of the fact that these countries or segments of these countries currently rest on the Caribbean plate. So we cannot be speaking about gold or the metallogeny of gold, and we're not also speaking about the geologic history that basically is responsible for the genesis of gold in these countries. And this is now where it can be very challenging to make it in a way that you can understand. So, anticipate that as I tell this story, that there will be aspects of it that will be very challenging, but I will do my best. And where there are any gaps, feel free to plug them in your comment section. Geologic history. Understanding geologic history means we have to have insight into the geologic timescale. Take a look at this geologic timescale imagery. You should be able to see that there exist different periods, eons, eras. What you should know is that older geologic timescale is at the bottom end and younger is at the top or above. And in terms of stratigraphy, which is pretty much a vertical procession, if you will, through different layers of rock or sediment. So as you hear me mention specific geologic timescales or names which represent specific geologic timescales, this imagery should be what you go back to for reference. Now, as it relates to all countries in focus for this video, Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic / Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Nicaragua, literature mentions that the oldest rocks for all of these countries is Cretaceous / Jurassic in age. And in terms of the specific geology or lithology, if you will, it is igneous based. At this time, I zone in a bit further on the geologic history of each of these countries in addition to the Caribbean plate. The Caribbean plate is a very complex geologic specimen in that there exist many different countries as well as many different lithologies on this one Caribbean plate. So specifically now, if you look at the image, you should see that Jamaica exists on a part extension of Nicaragua, or in other words, this pretty much can be interpreted as the Hess Escarpment. But similarly now, where Jamaica is concerned, to the right of Jamaica, there exists Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. Hispaniola and Puerto Rico exist somewhat in a more thrusting zone. They more so are closely adjoined or somewhat in collision with the North American plate. Uh, but in terms of the origin of the Caribbean plate, it is not conclusively agreed upon within the geologic or the academic geologic space. Two main theories exist. One is the Pacific origination model, and the other is the in situ origination model, or in other words, Caribbean plate originated within the Caribbean. Now, because of the fact that there may exist uh, unconformities or erosion of geologic record, as an example, plus the reality that all of the Caribbean plate is not yet fully explored, then in terms of the full concreteness of data and thus conclusions, it basically is going to remain inconclusive. So we just have to use what is presently available to us uh, in the literature or in the, the academic space uh, to basically arrive where we are today. In terms of the geologic time period that the Caribbean plate would have formed, specific to Google AI, this would have been within the Jurassic period. Where Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico exist today, this forms the northern extension of the Caribbean plate. And specifically, these countries are considered as the Greater Antillean Arc. As members of the Greater Antillean Arc, these countries are what we consider as extinct areas of volcanism on the Caribbean plate. Where Nicaragua is, which is to the western end of the Caribbean plate. Nicaragua exists on a subduction zone, well, part of Nicaragua, that is, exists on the subduction zone between the Caribbean plate and the Cocos plate. Nicaragua's geology today indicate that it experiences volcanism. In other words, it's a country of active volcanism. The basement of Nicaragua's geology is that of crystalline rocks, or it's rocks that have a larger crystal structure. They're more so rocks that would have been formed within the earth. And basically speaking, in terms of their nature, it pretty much could be that they are felsic to intermediate. The AI of Google indicates that there would have been, or there are areas of mafic intrusions in Nicaragua. Now, what it is that you need to keep in mind is that in terms of the felsic intermediate uh, lithology in the igneous sense, this basically supports explosive volcanism. Um, Now, in cross-referencing this geologic insight to that of Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. For Jamaica, there exists rocks that indicate explosive volcanic history as well as non-explosive volcanic history. This is reflected by rocks that are porphyritic in nature, such as andesites, and rocks basically that are aphanitic in nature. And an example of this is basalt. There also exists crystalline igneous rocks in Jamaica, an example of which is granodiorites. For Hispaniola, Google AI indicates that its origination rests in the early Cretaceous. The rocks of Hispaniola, specific to the geologic map you see, give reference to subduction and non-subduction volcanism. Gabbros, which is the intrusive form of basalt, and serpentinites give some additional insight in terms of the history of Hispaniola. Serpentinites, and in the context of the subduction, give that classification of Hispaniola as having that violent occurrence. Gabbros, especially with it being the intrusive form of basalt, gives indication that there basically would have been a degree of quiescence, or non-violent period of volcanism in Hispaniola's history, and pretty much it's just as a result of erosion that gabbros are able to be seen today. In Puerto Rico's case, literature indicates a volcanic arc origination specific to the Jurassic period, and as per the geologic map highlighted, the igneous rocks that are present include that of basalt. Mention is also made of amphibolites, which is a metamorphic rock. Amphibolites are said to be formed as a result of the increased pressure and or temperature applied to a protolith or to an original rock, such as basalt. Now, at this point, I just briefly want to mention this, that Hispaniola has serpentinized rocks, and they also have amphibolites. Puerto Rico is said to have amphibolites, which is higher temperature slash pressure applied to rocks, and this is its form of metamorphism. In Jamaica's case, not much is mentioned in the literature about amphibolite facies. However, we do have metamorphic rocks in the form of blue schist and green schist, and both of these rock types are said to be formed in less temperature slash pressure relative to amphibolite facies. Now, what I want to also mention though is that even though the geologic map of Jamaica doesn't specifically speak about peridotite, through my own field excursions, I would have come across rocks that highlight green minerals and or peridotite texture, or in that respect, I theorize that they are ophiolites. And with these said rocks being present in Hispaniola, they basically indicate close assemblage in terms of origination. All of this discussed brings us to the point of the metallogeny as it relates to gold, copper, in the context of Jamaica's potential, as well as the actual extraction locations in Dominican Republic and Nicaragua. So as we can see through the geologic history, all of these countries are closely linked in terms of the age of their origination, be it in the uh, late Jurassic and early Cretaceous period, in the rocks that form the basement of these countries, be it crystalline and basaltic, or explosive and non-explosive volcanism. In terms of metallogeny, Nicaragua leads the way in its gold deposits. As mentioned in Google AI, the Golden Triangle region of Nicaragua makes it the most gold producing country within the Central Americas. In the context of comparison with Caribbean countries discussed herein, Nicaragua's scale in its gold metallogeny is greater than that of Hispaniola. And if we're going to now look into the geologic context as well as the spatial context, Nicaragua being that of a much larger land area, gives greater insight in terms of the, the meaning behind the scale of Nicaragua's gold production. The total area of Nicaragua is said to be over 130,000 kilometers. Hispaniola, as the largest Greater Antillean member discussed herein, has a total area of over 76,000 kilometers. In Puerto Rico's case, whilst mention is made of the presence relating to gold, silver, and other metals, I have not come across the literature that gives description in terms of its scale. Now, in turning attention to Jamaica, the Bellasgate report that I would have referenced earlier in this discussion makes specific mention to a wide-scale copper metallogeny, and this is highlighted in a map of Jamaica. Now, you probably cannot see based on the pixelation of the image. However, in terms of the spatial reference of the copper porphyries, they are highlighted in areas such as Portland, Swift River, in St. Andrew, we have the above rocks in Lyre, sections of Cooper's Hill. In the central inlier, there is area of Bellas Gate. In the area of Hanover, cannot really identify specifically the community per se, but there are, areas at less concentration throughout the country. Now, what I would like to just briefly say is going back to one of my earlier videos about Portland's gold potential, and in that video I would have highlighted a land slippage, and there would have been the presence of mineralization, green color. This revelation in terms of this document now supports what it is that I would have hypothesized. Similarly, now, is that in the context of my discussions, brief mention of the Cooper's Hill, then this imagery indicates that definitely there is a degree of further exploration that's warranted, and this extends throughout the country. So in essence, what now we should be taking away from this is that Jamaica's wider spread of copper porphyries support the reality that we should have a wider spread of economic potential, if you will, for copper extraction and associated minerals such as gold. Now, at this point, to summarize all that I would have discussed herein, we can arrive at the conclusion that Nicaragua, Jamaica, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico has gold similarity in its metallogeny, and not just gold, but other minerals such as copper and silver. In terms of its metallogeny, it is closely associated with the geologic history of each of these countries. Each of these countries, in terms of its geologic history, share commonality in the context of its date of origination, as well as the Caribbean plate that they sit on. They also share similarity in terms of the inherent makeup of the geology, and in this respect, the subduction and non-subduction volcanism that would have been the past active reality for Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. And in the context of Nicaragua, the subduction volcanism that is still active today. This active volcanism for Nicaragua's case today supports the reality that Nicaragua, be it the largest gold producing nation discussed herein today, uh, the capacity is much higher and will continue to be much higher than the other countries mentioned because of the fact that volcanism is still active. In the context of Jamaica's copper producing potential, it is relatively high based on what the report has mentioned that I reference herein. And similarly, considering the close geologic resemblance to Hispaniola, and Hispaniola being, and specifically in Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, having an active gold mine that is very significant in its scale and production, that gives encouragement to the potential reality of Jamaica also bearing a relatively large scale gold/copper mine production